2. Liberalism, international cooperation, institutionalism, interdependence theory. Liberalism in international politics emphasizes cooperation, diplomacy, and economic interdependence over conflict. It challenges realism's assumption that the international system is purely anarchic and conflict-driven. 2.1. International cooperation. Introduction. Liberalism in international politics argues that states can cooperate through diplomacy, trade, and shared institutions rather than relying solely on military power or self-help strategies. Unlike realism, which sees conflict as inevitable due to an anarchic international system, liberalism suggests that states can create stable, peaceful relationships through cooperation and mutual benefit. International cooperation is a key principle of liberalism and is supported by mechanisms such as international institutions, economic interdependence, democratic governance, and diplomatic negotiations. These factors reduce incentives for war and promote stability. In the international system, this section explores the liberal perspective on international cooperation, mechanisms that promote cooperation, historical and contemporary examples. 2.1.1. The liberal perspective on international cooperation. Liberalism contends that international cooperation is not only possible, but essential for global stability. It challenges realist assumptions by highlighting how states can work together through institutions, shared values, and mutual economic interests. Key assumptions of international cooperation in liberalism. States are not always in conflict. Unlike realism, which assumes that states prioritize power competition, liberalism argues that states seek common interests in trade, security, and environmental policies. Institutions create order. International organizations like the United Nations, UN, World Trade Organization, WTO, and International Monetary Fund, IMF, help mediate disputes and establish rules that guide state behavior. Economic interdependence reduces conflict. When states rely on each other for trade and investment, war becomes costly and undesirable. Democratic governance fosters peace. The democratic peace theory suggests that democracies are less likely to go to war with each other, promoting long-term stability. Example, the European Union. EU transformed war-prone European nations into a cooperative, economic and political union, preventing conflicts like those seen in the early 20th century. 2.1.2. Mechanisms that promote international cooperation. Liberalism identifies several ways in which states overcome anarchy and promote peaceful cooperation. International institutions and organizations. International institutions reduce uncertainty by setting clear rules for diplomacy, trade, and security. They facilitate negotiations, dispute resolution, and collective action. Examples: United Nations UN maintains peace, coordinates humanitarian aid, and promotes human rights. World Trade Organization WTO regulates international trade, preventing trade wars. North Atlantic Treaty Organization NATO, a collective security alliance that deters aggression. Case study: the UN Security Council UNSC has played a role in peacekeeping missions in Bosnia, South Sudan, and Cyprus, preventing large-scale conflicts. Economic interdependence and free trade. Economic globalization makes war less desirable because countries benefit more from trade than conflict. States that trade extensively are less likely to engage in war due to the economic risks involved. Examples: China and the United States. Despite political tensions, their deep economic ties reduce the likelihood of direct military conflict. The European Union EU, former rivals, France, Germany, UK, now engage in economic cooperation rather than warfare. Case study after World War II, the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, ECSC, prevented further conflict by integrating the economies of European nations. This later evolved into the European Union (EU). C. Democratic peace theory. Democracies are less likely to go to war with each other due to shared norms, political transparency, and institutional constraints on war-making. Liberalism argues that promoting democracy helps foster long-term international peace. Examples: the United States and Canada. Despite sharing the world's longest border, they have never fought a war in modern history. Post-WWT Europe democratic institutions helped prevent another large-scale European war. Case study: the democratic peace theory explains why conflicts between the U.S. and Russia or China and Taiwan are more likely than conflicts between two democratic nations. A. Diplomatic negotiations and conflict resolution. Diplomacy allows states to resolve disputes without resorting to war. Liberalism promotes multilateralism, where multiple countries work together to address global issues. Examples: Iran nuclear deal 2015 prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons through diplomatic negotiations rather than military action. The Camp David Accords, 1978, negotiated peace between Egypt and Israel, ending decades of conflict. Case study: the Good Friday Agreement, 1998, ended violence in Northern Ireland, demonstrating the power of diplomatic cooperation. 2. Institutionalism. Neoliberal institutionalism, developed by Robert Keohane, argues that international organizations (IOs) play a crucial role in reducing uncertainty, enforcing agreements, and fostering cooperation among states. Unlike realism, which sees anarchy as a barrier to cooperation, institutionalism suggests that rules and institutions help states act cooperatively by providing stability and reducing transaction costs. Key functions of international institutions: rule-making and norms. Establish international laws and trade regulations, WTO, IMF. Conflict resolution, mediate disputes and prevent wars, UN, ICJ. Collective security, provide mutual defense alliances, NATO. Economic stability. Regulate global markets and financial crises, IMF, World Bank. Example: the WTO enforces trade rules, preventing conflicts between the U.S. and China. Significance: institutions reduce uncertainty, promote transparency, and encourage long-term cooperation, making global politics more predictable and less conflict-driven. 3. Interdependence theory. Interdependence theory argues that economic and political connections between states reduce the likelihood of conflict by making war more costly and cooperation more beneficial. As nations become more economically integrated through trade, investment, and shared institutions, they develop mutual dependencies that encourage diplomacy over military confrontation. Key principles: economic ties reduce war incentives. Nations avoid conflict when trade disruptions could harm their economies. Mutual gains from cooperation: states benefit more from stable trade and diplomatic relations than from war. Complex interdependence. Keohane and Nye power is not only military, but also economic, technological, and institutional. Example: despite political and military tensions, U.S. China economic interdependence, bilateral trade, supply chains, financial markets discourages open war, as both economies would suffer immense losses. Significance: interdependence fosters stability, encourages peaceful negotiations, and promotes long-term international cooperation over zero-sum competition. 2.4 Conclusion. Liberalism asserts that global governance, trade, and international institutions create stability by fostering cooperation, economic interdependence, and diplomatic conflict resolution. Unlike realism, which sees international politics as a struggle for power, liberalism emphasizes that institutions, UN, WTO, IMF, trade networks, and democratic values reduce conflict and promote peace. By encouraging rules-based interactions and mutual benefits, liberalism provides a framework for a more stable and cooperative global order.